Hi everyone, today I'm going to be talking about how race is represented on TV by looking at two sitcoms, Fresh Off the Boat and One Day at a Time. And essentially, both shows center on immigrant families navigating life in the US, but through very different racial and cultural perspectives. My main argument is that they both challenge racial stereotypes and push for racial representation, but they do so through very different constructions of race. Fresh Off the Boat shows how whiteness functions as the invisible norm that immigrant families must adapt to, while One Day at a Time makes race visible by openly addressing identity, discrimination, and cultural pride. And I'll be referencing the documentary White Like Me and the reading Racism Post-Race by Mukherjee to support my argument. So let's start off with Fresh Off the Boat. In the first episode, we see the Huang family, who are Taiwanese American, move from Washington, D.C. to suburban Florida. Right away, the show highlights how race shapes their experience as they face pressure and struggle to fit in with their new community. For example, when Eddie brings a homemade lunch to school, his white classmates react by saying it smells nasty and that it looks like worms, which clearly make him feel bad. As such, this moment reflects our lecture's idea that stereotypes form based on the social distance between the in-group and the out-group. Here, the white students act as the in-group, so their food and culture are treated as the normal standard. Meanwhile, Eddie represents the out-group, and he gets judged and stereotypes because he and his food are different from the dominant group. And well, later in the episode, we see how because he felt so embarrassed by the comments, he begged his mom to buy him Lunchables so he could blend into this white suburban culture and avoid standing out. And this perfectly ties into the documentary White Like Me, which argues that one of the greatest powers of whiteness in America is its invisibility. As Tim Wise states, white people in America are socialized to view themselves as the normal, while people of color are viewed as racial or other. So in other words, whiteness represents the default setting of American life, and everyone else is marked as different. So ultimately, the Huang's family has to adjust, explain, or defend parts of their identity in ways that white families never do. And instead of just being another family on the block, they are positioned as outsiders who have to constantly prove they belong. Now, let's look at One Day at a Time. In episode 1, we get introduced to a Cuban-American single mother and her multi-generational family living in LA. Right away, the show emphasizes Latinx identity, culture, and the politics that shape the Alvarez's family everyday life, from immigration and activism to language, family values, and cultural pride. This connects directly to our lecture's point that all media are ideological and historical, meaning that they reflect the cultural moment in which they're created. Because this show was released in 2017, a time when immigration and Latinx visibility were national issues, it makes sense that the series openly engages with race. We see this clearly in the scene where Penelope, the Cuban-American veteran mom, faces subtle racism at work, showing how racial politics continue to shape Latinx experiences. And this also connects to the Racism Post-Race reading by Mukherjee. As the reading explained, after Barack Obama was elected, post-racial ideology tried to claim that race no longer mattered and that talking about racism was unnecessary or divisive. However, the show rejects this very same idea. Rather than pretending that racism is over, the show insists that it still remains a part of everyday life. Additionally, the show resists essentialism, which, as our lecture explained, is the idea of reducing an entire group to a set of negative traits and using those traits to explain everything about them. And it does so by giving Lydia, Penelope, and Elena distinct identities. Lydia leans into the strong Cuban pride and tradition, while Penelope navigates the tension between cultural expectations and her modern American life, and Elena embraces activism and social justice. So this complexity pushes back against the one-dimensional stereotype that Latinx families are often given in U.S. media. And instead of being boxed into labels like loud, dramatic, or emotional, the Alvarez women are portrayed as multifaceted. So, When we compare these two shows side by side, we see that each reflects a different racial group and a distinct cultural moment in America. As mentioned, Fresh Off the Boat follows an Asian American family moving into a white suburb in the mid-1990s, while One Day at a Time centers on a Cuban American family living in LA during 2017. But we also see that Fresh Off the Boat uses humor and discomfort to show the family's pressure to assimilate, whereas One Day at a Time openly discusses identity and discrimination through direct conversations and strong cultural pride. These differences highlight how whiteness operates in each narrative. In Fresh Off the Boat, whiteness is the invisible norm that the Huangs must adapt to, and in One Day at a Time, it becomes a visible system that the Alvarezes critique and acknowledge. Lastly, when looking at the ladder of racial representation, Fresh Off the Boat moves beyond the ignore and pity stages by centering the Huangs as complex individuals and acknowledging them as human. As such, they reflect a more elevated form of representation. However, One Day at a Time sits even higher on the accept stage, since it portrays the characters as authentic with different political identities and perspectives. And ultimately, both shows reveal how racial identity is shaped by their time periods, racial focus, and cultural environment, offering two different portrayals of what it means to navigate race in America. So, in conclusion, to wrap up, both Fresh Off the Boat and One Day at a Time demonstrate that television can serve as a mirror for how race is constructed in the U.S. through stereotypes, resistance, and evolving cultural awareness. Fresh Off the Boat reveals how whiteness shapes belonging and identity for Asian Americans, while One Day at a Time shows Latinx characters claiming their own space and voice within that system. As Tim Wise and Mukherjee argue, the idea of colorblind America is dangerous because pretending race doesn't matter only protects white privilege and allows it to persist. Both shows back this up by showing that when racism isn't talked about, it doesn't disappear, it just shows up differently. So in reality, we cannot be post-racial when race continues to shape opportunities, belonging, and daily life. As a final thought, representation isn't just about being seen, it's about how we're seen, who controls the narrative, and what ideologies get reinforced or challenged through those images. And here are my references. Thank you.